You ever ruin your own life in less than 15 seconds? Officer Ryan Keller was about to. Rain hammered the empty stretch of Route 47 just outside Richmond, Virginia, turning the asphalt silver beneath the flashing patrol lights. The storm had rolled in fast after midnight, thick clouds swallowing the moon, wind pushing loose newspaper and dead leaves across the shoulder of the highway. Ryan stepped out of his cruiser with one hand resting near his belt, his flashlight slicing through the rain in sharp white streaks. Ahead of him sat a dark blue Lexus sedan, engine idling softly, windshield wipers dragging back and forth in a tired rhythm. He had been following the vehicle for nearly 2 miles after spotting it leaving downtown Federal District offices. Expensive car, tinted windows, black driver, late night. In Ryan Keller's mind, that combination was usually enough. He adjusted the collar of his rain-soaked jacket and walked toward the driver's side window with slow confidence, the kind that came from years of wearing a badge in counties where people rarely questioned officers like him. Inside the vehicle, the woman lowered her window halfway. Warm air drifted out, carrying the faint scent of coffee and old paper files. She looked calm, almost too calm. Mid-40s maybe. Dark brown skin. Hair neatly pinned back despite the long day she clearly had behind her. A charcoal blazer rested over her shoulders, and a stack of legal folders sat in the passenger seat beside a leather briefcase. Ryan noticed the federal parking decal on the windshield and smirked slightly. "License and registration," he said flatly. The woman reached slowly into her purse without arguing. Her movements were measured, controlled, almost graceful. No fear, no panic. That irritated him more than if she had yelled. Rainwater dripped from the edge of his flashlight as she handed over her documents. Ryan glanced down at the license, and for the briefest second, his eyes narrowed. Naomi Whitaker. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. He leaned slightly closer, shining the flashlight toward the interior. "You know why I pulled you over tonight?" Naomi looked at him steadily. "No, officer. I don't." Her voice was low and composed, the kind of voice used to being listened to in important rooms. Ryan ignored the feeling creeping up his spine. "You crossed the center line back there about half a mile." Naomi glanced ahead through the rain-smeared windshield. "I don't believe I did." Ryan gave a humorless chuckle. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm saying I've been driving carefully because of the weather." The silence that followed tightened like a wire between them. Behind Ryan, the patrol lights painted the wet road red and blue. Trucks hissed past in the distance, their headlights vanishing into sheets of rain. He studied her face again. Still calm. Still dignified. People usually got nervous by now, especially when they were alone on a dark road after midnight with an armed officer standing over them. But Naomi Whitaker sat perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, eyes steady and unreadable. Ryan suddenly felt the need to remind her who controlled the situation. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. Naomi blinked once. "Officer, may I ask why?" "Because I said so." Another pause. Then slowly, she opened the door and stepped into the storm. Her heels touched the wet pavement carefully. Rain immediately soaked the shoulders of her blazer, but she didn't complain. Ryan walked her toward the rear of the Lexus while pretending to inspect the car with his flashlight. In reality, his mind was already moving somewhere darker, somewhere reckless. 2 weeks earlier, his captain had warned the department about declining arrest numbers before an upcoming city review. Ryan had heard the whispers around the precinct too. Budget cuts, internal investigations, public scrutiny, officers needing stronger statistics to justify funding. He hated all of it. Hated the feeling that cops were losing power every year. And standing in front of him now was the kind of woman he had spent his whole career quietly resenting. Successful, educated, untouchable. He glanced toward his cruiser camera. Rain distorted the view. "Good enough. Stay right here," he told her. Naomi folded her arms against the cold wind, but said nothing. Ryan moved back toward his patrol car, opened the passenger door, and stared for a long moment at the small evidence bag hidden beneath a folder on the seat. His jaw tightened. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled across the Virginia sky. He grabbed the bag and slipped it into his jacket pocket. 15 seconds. That was all it would take. 15 seconds to destroy a stranger's life. 15 seconds to become the worst mistake of his own. Ryan walked back toward the Lexus, rain dripping from his brow, heartbeat strangely loud beneath the storm. Naomi watched him approach without moving. Then her eyes shifted briefly toward his jacket pocket. Just briefly, but enough. And for the first time that night, something cold passed silently across her face. Not fear. Recognition. Naomi Whitaker had spent most of her life learning how to remain calm, while men tried to make her feel small. The rain soaked through the sleeves of her blazer as she stood beside the Lexus with her arms folded tightly against the cold wind rolling across Route 47. Officer Ryan Keller circled the vehicle slowly, one hand brushing against the side of his jacket where the small evidence bag rested hidden in the pocket. Naomi watched the reflection of his movements in the dark glass of her rear passenger door. The storm distorted everything in ripples of red and blue light, but not enough to hide intent. She had seen intent like that before. 23 years earlier, Naomi was 12 years old sitting on the cracked front steps of a Baltimore row house, while two patrol officers shoved her father against a police cruiser outside their apartment building. She still remembered the sound of rainwater dripping from the fire escape that night, the smell of wet concrete, the humiliation in her father's eyes as neighbors peeked through blinds pretending not to stare. Her father, Leonard Whitaker, worked overnight cleaning office buildings downtown. He wore the same gray janitor uniform 6 nights a week and carried cough drops in his pocket because the chemical fumes irritated his throat. He was not loud. He was not dangerous. But he was black, exhausted, and standing in the wrong neighborhood when a store nearby reported a robbery. The officers never found evidence. They never apologized either. Naomi remembered her mother holding her hand inside the apartment while police lights flashed through the curtains like silent lightning. Do not let anger decide who you become, her mother had whispered that night. Naomi never forgot those words. Years later, while classmates chased corporate law careers and 6-figure salaries, Naomi studied constitutional law with a kind of quiet obsession. She worked double shifts at the university library, slept 4 hours a night, graduated at the top of her class from Georgetown Law. Every step of her life had been built carefully, like glass balanced against gravity. She became the youngest black female federal judge in Virginia at 43 years old, respected for her discipline, feared for her precision, and known inside federal courtrooms for never raising her voice even when powerful men did. But standing beside that highway in the middle of the storm, Naomi felt something old pressing against her chest again. Not fear. Memory. Ryan stopped near the trunk of the Lexus and glanced toward her briefly before shining his flashlight through the rear window. His expression carried the smug confidence of a man who believed the system naturally protected him. Naomi had seen that expression too. Courtrooms were full of men like Ryan Keller. Men who mistook authority for superiority. Men who believed a badge, a title, or a family name transformed suspicion into truth. "You nervous, ma'am?" Ryan asked casually. Naomi looked at him evenly. "Should I be?" He smirked faintly but did not answer. Instead, he opened the rear passenger door and leaned inside for several seconds. Naomi listened carefully to the rain striking metal, to distant tires rushing across wet pavement, to the soft static crackling from Ryan's shoulder radio. Every detail sharpened around her senses. Then she heard it, the tiny sound of plastic brushing leather. Her eyes lowered slightly toward his jacket pocket as he stepped back out of the vehicle. The pocket looked flatter now. Ryan shut the door with deliberate force and turned toward her. "Ma'am, I am going to ask you one more time if there is anything illegal inside this vehicle." Naomi held his gaze for a long moment. Thunder rolled low across the sky behind them. "No," she answered calmly. Ryan nodded slowly as if he had expected the response. Then he reached into the back seat and lifted a small, clear evidence bag into the rain. White powder shifted inside beneath the patrol lights. "That is interesting," he said quietly. The storm seemed to fall silent around them for one suspended second. Naomi stared at the bag without moving. Her face did not change, but inside her chest something heavy settled into place with terrible clarity. Ryan stepped closer, rain dripping from the edge of his jaw. "Turn around for me, ma'am." Naomi looked at him carefully now. Really looked at him. Young, angry, certain. The kind of man who had probably never once imagined consequences arriving for him personally. Her eyes moved briefly toward the dark dashboard camera inside his cruiser, then toward the highway beyond the flashing lights where a lonely gas station glowed faintly across the road through the rain. Finally, she looked back at Ryan Keller. "Officer," she said softly, You still have time to walk away from this. Ryan Keller laughed softly when she said it. Not a real laugh. More like the quiet sound people made when they believed they were untouchable. Rainwater slid down the side of his face as he tightened his grip on the plastic evidence bag. That sounds a lot like a threat, ma'am, he said. Naomi Whitaker did not answer immediately. The storm pushed cold wind across the empty highway, tugging lightly at the edge of her soaked blazer. Behind Ryan, the patrol lights continued spinning across the wet asphalt in endless circles of red and blue. Naomi looked tired now, but not defeated. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the evidence bag in his hand, then toward the camera mounted inside the front windshield of the patrol cruiser. Ryan noticed the movement and instinctively glanced back at the vehicle himself. For the first time that night, something uncertain flickered across his expression. Just for a second. Then it vanished. Turn around, he repeated. Naomi slowly placed her hands behind her back without resisting. The metal handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists with cold precision. Ryan guided her toward the side of the road while speaking into his radio in a calm, rehearsed voice. Dispatch, I have probable cause and narcotics recovery during a traffic stop. Female suspect detained without incident. Female suspect. Naomi almost smiled at the phrase. After 20 years inside federal courtrooms, she understood better than most people how language shaped perception. One word changed everything. Suspect instead of citizen. Narcotics instead of planted evidence. Detained instead of humiliated. Ryan opened the rear door of the cruiser, and Naomi carefully lowered herself into the back seat. The interior smelled faintly of coffee, damp fabric, and old cigarette smoke trapped deep in the upholstery. Water dripped from the ends of her hair onto the plastic divider as Ryan shut the door firmly behind her. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched him stand outside speaking to another responding officer who had just arrived on scene. Officer Caleb Morris. Mid-30s. Heavy-set. Nervous posture. Naomi recognized the type instantly. The kind of officer who avoided eye contact during testimony. The kind who knew when something felt wrong but stayed quiet because silence was safer than integrity. Caleb looked toward Naomi sitting in the back of the cruiser, then lowered his voice while speaking to Ryan. Ryan answered with irritation visible even through the storm. Caleb nodded stiffly after a moment and stepped back toward his own vehicle without arguing further. Naomi leaned her head lightly against the cold divider behind her and closed her eyes for a brief second. Somewhere deep beneath the steady exhaustion in her chest, anger threatened to surface. Not explosive anger. Worse, controlled anger. The kind built slowly over decades of watching systems fail the same people in the same ways. She thought about her father again. Leonard Whitaker, standing silently at the kitchen sink years ago after that wrongful stop in Baltimore, staring out the window while her mother reheated coffee neither of them drank. Naomi had asked him once why he never filed a complaint. Leonard gave a tired smile and said something she never forgot. Because some people wear the badge like armor, baby. And armor makes cowards feel brave. Outside the cruiser, Ryan finally climbed back into the driver's seat. He removed his wet gloves and tossed them carelessly onto the dashboard. You know, he said while pulling onto the highway, most people in your situation are a little more emotional. Naomi stared ahead through the rain-covered windshield. What exactly is my situation, officer? Ryan shrugged. Middle of the night. Drugs in the car. Federal position. Public embarrassment. That is a rough combination. Naomi turned slightly toward him. You seem very comfortable assuming how this ends. Ryan smirked faintly as windshield wipers dragged across the glass. I have been doing this a long time. Naomi looked at the side of his face carefully now. The sharp jaw. The restless eyes. The arrogance stretched tightly over insecurity. Then something clicked quietly in her memory. Keller. The name settled heavily into place. Her gaze lowered toward the silver nameplate attached to his uniform. Ryan Keller. 20 years ago in Baltimore County, there had been another Keller. Sheriff Daniel Keller. Internal corruption investigation. Civil rights violations. Evidence tampering accusations buried under years of political protection. Naomi herself had prosecuted one of the final federal hearings connected to that investigation nearly 8 years earlier after becoming assistant district counsel. Daniel Keller avoided prison through procedural deals and medical retirement. But the scandal destroyed his career. Naomi remembered the fury in the old sheriff's eyes during sentencing. Now she looked again at Ryan's face and saw it clearly. The same eyes, the same bitterness, the same hunger for control. Ryan noticed her staring. Something funny? Naomi spoke softly. Your father taught you this, did he not? The cruiser fell completely silent except for the sound of rain hammering the roof. Ryan's hands tightened almost invisibly around the steering wheel. And suddenly Naomi knew with absolute certainty that he recognized her too. Ryan. Keller did not answer her question right away. His jaw tightened as the patrol cruiser moved through the storm toward Fairfax County Detention Center, headlights cutting pale tunnels through the rain. Naomi sat quietly in the back seat, wrists still secured, her reflection flickering faintly across the divider glass each time lightning flashed beyond the highway. The silence between them no longer felt like control. It felt like exposure. Ryan kept both hands locked on the steering wheel, but his breathing had changed. Slightly heavier now. Slightly uneven. Naomi watched him carefully. You prosecuted him, Ryan finally said without looking back. His voice carried something sharper than anger. Something inherited. Naomi answered calmly. Your father prosecuted himself the moment he believed the law belonged only to certain people. Ryan laughed under his breath, but there was no humor in it. That is not how he remembers it. People rarely remember themselves accurately. The windshield wipers dragged across the glass again with tired rhythm. Outside, the storm deepened over the empty Virginia roads. Gas stations glowed like distant islands through the rain, while 18-wheelers rumbled past in blurred streaks of white light. Ryan swallowed hard and adjusted his grip on the wheel. You people always talk like that, he muttered. Naomi tilted her head slightly. You people? Ryan immediately realized he had said too much. His expression hardened again. Forget it. But Naomi did not forget it. She had heard versions of those words her entire life. In classrooms where teachers assumed she needed extra help. In restaurants where servers handed the check to white colleagues instead of her. In courtrooms where opposing attorneys mistook calmness for weakness until she dismantled their arguments line by line beneath federal oath. Bias rarely arrived screaming anymore. It arrived polished. Smiling. Procedural. Ryan pulled into the detention center parking lot just after 1:30 in the morning. Rainwater streamed across the concrete beneath bright security lights. Naomi stepped carefully out of the cruiser as another officer approached carrying intake paperwork. The younger deputy stopped abruptly when he recognized her face. Judge Whitaker, he asked before catching himself. Ryan shot him a warning glance sharp enough to silence the room. Federal narcotics possession, Ryan said firmly while handing over the evidence bag. Recovered during lawful traffic stop. Naomi noticed the deputy hesitate while accepting the paperwork. Fear passed briefly across his face. Not fear of her. Fear of choosing the wrong side. Inside the detention lobby, fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. The air smelled like disinfectant, stale coffee, and wet jackets drying slowly near the front desk heaters. Naomi stood calmly during processing while officers whispered quietly behind computer screens. One woman working overnight intake looked visibly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact entirely, as she removed Naomi's watch and personal belongings. Ryan remained near the counter watching everything with folded arms, determined to project certainty. But Naomi could already see tiny cracks forming around him. Small things. The restless tapping of his fingers. The way he kept glancing toward the security cameras overhead. The way his voice became slightly louder every time another officer walked by. People trying too hard to appear confident usually were not. Any calls you want to make? The intake deputy asked softly. Naomi lifted her eyes toward the clock on the wall. 1:47 in the morning. Yes, she said. I need to contact federal counsel. Ryan stepped forward immediately. That can wait until morning. Naomi looked directly at him now. You are making another mistake. Ryan stared back coldly. No. The mistake happened years ago when people like you started thinking a title made you untouchable. Naomi held his gaze for several seconds. No, Officer Keller. The mistake happened when good officers stayed silent around bad ones. The room fell still again. Even the typing behind the front desk slowed. Ryan's face darkened instantly, but before he could respond, a sharp electronic tone interrupted the silence from somewhere deeper inside the station. One of the overnight clerks looked down at her monitor, frowned, then glanced toward Naomi again with sudden confusion. Another notification appeared. Then another. The clerk straightened slowly in her chair. "Sir," she said carefully toward Ryan. "Internal Affairs just flagged this arrest for immediate review." Ryan froze. Only for a second. But Naomi saw it clearly. The first real fracture. The clerk continued reading her screen. "It says there was an automatic trigger connected to the defendant's federal status." Rain hammered softly against the station windows, while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then the clerk's expression changed again as another message appeared across her monitor. "Sir," she whispered this time, "they are requesting all body camera footage immediately." Ryan's eyes shifted instinctively toward the evidence locker down the hallway. And in that moment, Naomi Whitaker knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had not planned nearly as carefully as he thought he had. The detention center felt different now, as if the air itself had tightened around every surface inside the building. Naomi Whitaker stood near the intake counter with her hands still restrained, but her posture unchanged, steady, controlled, almost detached from the chaos forming around her case file. Officer Ryan Keller had stopped speaking entirely. He stood a few steps away from the counter, staring at the flashing monitor where internal affairs notifications continued to stack one after another like silent alarms he could no longer ignore. The clerk behind the desk swallowed nervously as she read the latest update again. "All associated footage has been flagged for immediate forensic review," she repeated, her voice lower now, uncertain. Ryan finally moved, stepping closer to the counter. "That is standard procedure," he said quickly, but the words sounded rehearsed even to himself. Naomi turned her head slightly toward him. "Is it?" she asked quietly. The single word carried no emotion, only precision. Ryan hesitated. That hesitation lasted less than a second, but it was enough for the room to feel it. The clerk avoided looking at either of them now, pretending to focus on her keyboard as if distance could protect her from whatever was unfolding. A supervisor entered from the side hallway moments later, holding a tablet in one hand and a printed incident report in the other. His expression was serious in a way that immediately shifted the energy in the room. "Officer Keller," he said, glancing between Ryan and the screen. "We need you in the back office. Now." Ryan's jaw tightened. "I am processing an act of arrest." "Now," the supervisor repeated, firmer this time. A brief silence followed. Ryan looked toward Naomi once, as if measuring something invisible in her expression, then turned and walked down the hallway. His footsteps were controlled, but the rhythm had changed. Less confident, more measured. Naomi remained at the counter as the clerk finished entering her information. For the first time since the stop, no one was speaking directly to her. She noticed the shift immediately. Not respect, not apology, something closer to uncertainty. People inside institutions always recognized the moment a situation stopped belonging to them. 10 minutes later, the supervisor returned alone. He placed the tablet down gently on the counter and cleared his throat. "Judge Whitaker," he said carefully, now fully addressing her title for the first time since her arrival. "There appears to be an active review of the arrest's circumstances." Naomi nodded slightly. "I am aware." The supervisor hesitated again, then continued. "Internal systems have cross-referenced the evidence submission with a flagged federal oversight protocol. Your detention is being temporarily paused pending confirmation of chain of custody integrity." The words hung in the air like something no one in the room had rehearsed saying out loud. Naomi remained still. "And Officer Keller?" she asked. The supervisor exhaled slowly. "He is currently being interviewed regarding procedural compliance." From the hallway, faint voices echoed through the station walls, indistinct but urgent. Naomi did not turn to listen. She already understood what was happening. Systems rarely failed all at once. They failed in sequence. First came confusion, then hesitation, then exposure. Ryan Keller stood inside the back office under fluorescent lighting that felt harsher than anything outside in the storm. Two internal affairs investigators sat across from him, reviewing documents on a laptop. One of them slid a still image across the table, a frame pulled from security footage outside the gas station across Route 47. Ryan looked down at it. The angle was clear, the timing precise, the moment undeniable. The second investigator spoke calmly. "We have confirmed external recording from a civilian camera that contradicts the physical placement of the evidence recovered during the stop." Ryan did not respond immediately. The room felt smaller than it had 10 minutes earlier. "That is not accurate," he finally said. But his voice no longer carried authority. It carried strain. Back in the intake area, Naomi stood quietly as the clerk finished printing temporary release documentation pending review. The paper slid across the counter toward her, but she did not reach for it immediately. Instead, she looked toward the hallway where Ryan had been taken. Not with satisfaction, not with anger, with something more measured. Understanding. She had seen this moment before in courtrooms, just with different names and different uniforms. The realization when someone discovers the system they thought protected them does not bend. It records. The clerk finally spoke again, more softly now. Judge Whitaker, you are free to go pending confirmation. Naomi nodded once. As she was escorted toward the exit, the storm outside had begun to weaken. Rain still fell, but the force had softened into a steady rhythm against the glass doors. Behind her, the station remained in motion, voices rising and falling in controlled urgency. But Naomi did not look back. As the doors opened and cold night air met her face, she paused briefly at the threshold. Somewhere inside the building, Officer Ryan Keller was still answering questions he thought he could control. Naomi stepped forward into the rain. The storm had not ended, but something had shifted inside it, something irreversible and quiet, like the moment before a long-delayed truth finally begins to speak for itself. The rain outside the detention center had softened into a slow, steady rhythm, as if the storm itself had lost interest in continuing. Naomi Whitaker stood under the small overhang near the entrance, the cold night air brushing against her damp blazer while water still clung to the edges of her sleeves. The automatic doors behind her slid shut with a mechanical whisper, sealing off the tension inside the building. For the first time since the traffic stop, there was no immediate pressure around her, no officers directing her movement, no procedural commands shaping her next step. Only silence. Naomi inhaled slowly, letting the air settle into her lungs. It was not relief she felt. It was recalibration. Across the parking lot, the glow of streetlights reflected off the wet asphalt in long, distorted lines, breaking apart with each ripple of rainwater. A patrol cruiser exited the lot at low speed, its tires hissing against the pavement. Inside that vehicle, Ryan Keller sat alone in the back seat, no longer the one issuing commands, no longer the one controlling direction. The cruiser moved because someone else had decided it should. Naomi watched it pass without expression. Inside the detention center, everything had shifted in a matter of minutes. Outside, the world still looked the same. That was always how it worked. Change rarely announced itself loudly. It unfolded quietly, inside systems already strained by contradiction. Naomi turned slightly as footsteps approached behind her. It was the night supervisor from earlier, holding a thin file folder instead of the tablet he had carried before. His face carried a different weight now, less authority, more caution. Judge Whitaker, he said again, as if repeating her title would stabilize the situation. You are no longer under detention status. We will need you to remain available for formal review statements. Naomi nodded once. I understand. The supervisor hesitated, then lowered his voice. Off the record, this situation escalated faster than anyone expected. Naomi looked at him calmly. Situations do not escalate without conditions already in place. He did not respond to that. Instead, he shifted the folder slightly in his hands. There is something else you should be aware of, he said. Officer Keller's background check triggered a secondary flag during processing. Internal Affairs is now reviewing a prior connection involving his family history. Naomi did not react outwardly, but her attention sharpened. Clarify. The supervisor opened the file slightly, scanning a line before speaking. His father was previously involved in a federal misconduct investigation approximately 20 years ago. Case was resolved through administrative separation, but records indicate a prior interaction with federal prosecution connected to you. The rain seemed to slow in Naomi's perception as she processed the information. For a moment, she did not speak. Then she exhaled quietly. Daniel Keller, she said. The supervisor nodded, surprised. Yes. Naomi looked away toward the empty highway beyond the parking lot. The pieces aligned in a way that no longer felt coincidental. It never was coincidence. It was inheritance. Patterns repeating through different names, different uniforms, different years, but the same structure underneath. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. We are still confirming relevance to current proceedings, he added quickly, as if trying to separate himself from the implication. Naomi finally turned back toward him. You do not need confirmation to recognize a pattern, she said. The supervisor said nothing. Inside the building behind them, fluorescent light still spilled through the glass doors, reflecting off the wet pavement in faint geometric shapes. Somewhere inside, phones were ringing, printers were running, voices were overlapping in controlled urgency. Naomi could imagine the exact sequence without being inside. Reports being written, statements being compared, gaps being noticed. Outside accountability always began as internal discomfort before it became public consequence. A car pulled into the far end of the lot, headlights briefly sweeping across the entrance before turning off. Naomi watched it, but did not move. Her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. She took it out and glanced at the screen. One message. Federal counsel assigned. Stand by for contact. Naomi did not open it immediately. Instead, she looked back once more at the building behind her. Inside, Officer Ryan Keller was no longer just an arresting officer in a routine traffic stop. He was now a subject in a procedural investigation expanding beyond the limits of one night, one decision, one assumption of control. Naomi placed her phone back into her pocket and stepped off the concrete overhang into the light rain. Each step toward the parking lot felt steady, deliberate, unhurried. There was no urgency in her movement because urgency belonged to people who still believed outcomes were uncertain. Naomi had learned long ago that outcomes rarely changed suddenly. They revealed themselves gradually, then all at once. Behind her, the detention center doors opened briefly as another officer stepped outside, scanning the lot before returning inside. No one called her back. No one stopped her. The system was still catching up to itself. Naomi continued walking toward her vehicle, the sound of rain growing softer as she moved further from the building, carrying with her the quiet certainty that what had begun on a dark highway would not end inside a single night of paperwork and interviews. It would continue, as all truth eventually does, until every part of it that had been hidden was no longer able to remain unseen. The federal courthouse in downtown Richmond was still closed for the night, but inside the system, nothing ever truly stopped moving. Files were being pulled, timestamps were being verified, and digital footprints were being reconstructed layer by layer under administrative review. Naomi Whitaker sat alone in a black sedan parked 2 blocks away, the engine off, rain tapping softly against the roof like distant fingers testing glass. She had not started the car yet, not because she was waiting for permission, but because she was waiting for confirmation of something she already understood. Truth did not arrive in a single moment. It arrived in fragments that eventually stopped pretending to be separate. Inside her phone, the message from federal counsel remained unread. She stared at it briefly, then placed the device face down on the passenger seat. Across town, inside the Internal Affairs Division office, Officer Ryan Keller stood under fluorescent lighting that now felt colder than the rain outside. His jacket was gone, his uniform shirt slightly wrinkled. The confidence that had followed him for years like a second shadow was no longer visible in his posture. On the table in front of him, a laptop played back video footage in silence. The frame showed a clear angle from a gas station camera across Route 47. The timestamp aligned exactly with the traffic stop. The image showed the vehicle, the stop, the movement near the passenger side door, and the moment where something small and deliberate appeared to contradict everything that had been written in his report. Ryan watched without blinking, but his breathing had slowed in a way that no longer matched control. It matched recognition. Across from him, one of the investigators spoke carefully. "We are not asking for interpretation," he said. "We are confirming sequence of events." Ryan did not respond. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the screen, as if looking away might change what had already been recorded. "There will be a formal administrative hearing," the investigator continued. "Until then, your authority is suspended pending review." Those words did not land with impact. They landed with absence. Something that had always been assumed to exist was now temporarily removed, and in that absence, every previous decision became visible in a different light. Ryan finally leaned back in the chair. "You are basing everything on one camera angle," he said quietly. The investigator shook his head. "We are basing everything on multiple independent sources that align without contradiction." Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Procedural silence. The kind that appears when systems stop debating and start documenting. Back in Naomi Whitaker's vehicle, she finally started the engine. The dashboard lights glowed softly across her face as she adjusted the rearview mirror. Rain continued to fall, but the storm no longer felt central to anything happening around her. It had become background. She pulled out slowly from the curb and merged into the empty late-night streets. Her mind was not on Ryan Keller anymore. It was on structure, on pattern, on repetition, the kind that never announced itself until it was already embedded. 20 years earlier, she had stood in a different courtroom watching a different Keller family name move through a different version of the same system. The details had changed. The outcomes had been negotiated differently, but the shape of it had remained consistent. Accountability delayed. Accountability redirected. Accountability softened until it no longer resembled itself. Her phone vibrated again. This time she answered. A calm voice on the other end identified themselves as federal counsel and confirmed what she already suspected. Judge Whitaker, we have initiated parallel review of the arrest and associated procedural conduct, the voice said. Naomi listened without interruption. You will be required to provide a formal statement within the next 24 hours. Understood, she replied. There was a pause. Then the voice added, there is one additional detail you should be aware of. The officer involved has prior family association with a sealed federal misconduct case connected indirectly to your earlier judicial record. Naomi already knew. Yes, she said simply. The voice hesitated. Then you understand why this may expand beyond a single incident. Naomi looked through her windshield at the empty intersection ahead. Streetlights reflected on wet pavement in long, fractured lines. It already has, she said. In another part of the city, Ryan Keller sat alone in the interview room after the investigators had stepped out to continue verification procedures. The silence in the room was no longer neutral. It felt layered, like it contained more than what was visible. He looked down at his hands resting on the table. For the first time in years, he did not see authority there. He saw exposure. And somewhere beneath that realization, something else began to form. Not anger, not denial. Something far more unfamiliar. Uncertainty that no amount of training or inherited confidence could immediately resolve. Outside, the rain continued to fall across Richmond, steady and indifferent, as if the city itself had already moved past the moment and was waiting for everyone inside it to catch up. The federal courthouse lights came on early that morning, even though the building was not yet open to the public. Inside, corridors that usually carried the echo of measured footsteps and quiet authority now carried something different. Controlled urgency. Naomi Whitaker stood in a glass-walled conference room on the 6th floor, watching attorneys and federal investigators move through preliminary documentation with careful precision. Nothing about her posture suggested disruption, yet everything around her had already shifted because of her presence. A printed transcript from the Internal Affairs Review sat open on the table in front of her, but she was not reading it. She had already memorized its structure during the night. Across the city, Officer Ryan Keller sat in a different federal holding office under observation review protocol. The room was plain, functional, stripped of anything that could be interpreted as comfort or intimidation. A single clock ticked above the door, marking time in a way that felt intentionally indifferent. Ryan had not spoken for over 20 minutes. His hands rested on the table, fingers loosely interlocked, but his posture no longer carried the stiffness of control. It carried something closer to realization. The investigators returned without ceremony. One of them placed a second folder beside the first. We have completed cross-verification with external footage, he said. Ryan looked up slowly, and the investigator did not immediately answer. Instead, he slid a printed still image across the table. It showed the highway, the patrol cruiser, the moment before the arrest sequence escalated into documentation. But this time, there was a difference. A secondary reflection captured in the wet surface of the road. A detail too small to notice in real time, but impossible to ignore in forensic review. Ryan stared at it without speaking. The investigator continued. There is also corroboration from a civilian witness who was present within visual range of the stop. Ryan's throat tightened slightly. Who? The investigator hesitated, then answered. A maintenance worker at the adjacent fuel station. She recorded video from her personal device after observing unusual conduct during the stop sequence. Ryan leaned back in his chair. That is not enough to overturn procedure. His voice sounded practiced again, but thinner now, less certain. The second investigator spoke this time. This is not about overturning procedure. This is about establishing intent. The word hung in the air longer than anything else. Intent. In another part of the courthouse, Naomi was finally reviewing the same sequence of documents, but from the opposite perspective. She was not surprised by what she saw. She was confirming it. Pattern recognition, reinforced by time. Systems rarely failed randomly. They failed predictably, along familiar lines of behavior that repeated until interrupted. A federal counsel entered the room quietly and placed a new briefing file in front of her. Judge Whitaker, he said, the department has authorized expanded review beyond this incident. Naomi looked up. Define expanded. Officer Keller's prior conduct history, training evaluations, and familial linkage to a previously sealed misconduct case have been added to the scope of investigation. Naomi closed the folder gently. That was not added, she said calmly. That was always there. The counsel did not respond immediately. Naomi stood and walked toward the window. From that height, Richmond looked structured and orderly. Streets aligned in predictable geometry. Traffic moving in controlled cycles. But she knew better than most people that order on the surface did not guarantee integrity underneath it. Behind her, the counsel spoke again. There is pressure from multiple departments to resolve this quickly. Naomi turned slightly. Resolution without understanding is not resolution, she said. At that exact moment, across the city, Ryan Keller was being escorted into a formal review chamber for final questioning. The lighting in the room was warmer than the previous space, but it did not feel more comfortable. It felt more revealing. One of the investigators opened the final section of the case file. We are going to ask you directly, he said. Do you confirm that the evidence recovered during the stop was in your continuous possession at all times prior to submission? Ryan paused. For the first time since the night began, he did not respond immediately. Not because he was calculating, because he was remembering. Small moments he had ignored. The timing, the angle, the hesitation he had dismissed as irrelevant at the roadside. Naomi Whitaker standing in the rain without fear. Not resisting, not pleading, observing. Ryan finally spoke. I followed procedure. The investigator nodded slightly. That was not the question. Silence filled the room again. Not the silence of control. The silence of narrowing options. In the courthouse, Naomi received a final message notification from federal counsel. She glanced at it once. Case escalation confirmed. Preliminary findings indicate procedural breach pending formal hearing. She closed the screen without emotion. Outside the courthouse windows, morning light began to cut through the remaining cloud cover. The storm from the night before was gone, but the city still carried its residue in wet pavement and delayed reflection. Naomi remained standing by the window for a moment longer, watching the city continue its movement as if nothing significant had changed. But she knew better. Change rarely announced itself in the moment it began. It announced itself later, when the consequences could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. And somewhere deep inside the same system that had once allowed certainty without question, the structure was now beginning to answer back. The federal courthouse was completely awake now, not in the sense of activity, but in the sense of consequence. Doors that usually opened for scheduled proceedings were now opening for emergency meetings. Conversations that normally stayed behind closed chambers were now spilling into hallways in low, controlled tones. Naomi Whitaker stood alone in a quiet corridor on the 7th floor, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression unchanged even as everything around her continued to shift. She was no longer a detained subject, no longer a procedural case. She was now the center point of a widening federal review. Inside a secured conference room down the hall, a final briefing was underway. Multiple federal counsel representatives were present along with oversight investigators and a senior review coordinator. On the screen, a consolidated timeline of events from the previous night was displayed in precise segments. Naomi had already seen it twice. Every second accounted for. Every action reconstructed. Every discrepancy isolated. Officer Ryan Keller sat in a separate room under observation protocol, now officially removed from active duty pending administrative determination. The uniform he had worn the night before had been replaced with a plain gray detention-issued jacket. There were no flashing lights here, no urgency in movement, only procedure unfolding at its most precise level. Across the table from him, the lead investigator finally closed the folder he had been reviewing. All evidence streams have been synchronized, he said. We are now operating under confirmed factual sequence. Ryan looked down at the table. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before. What does that mean for me? The investigator did not immediately respond. Instead, he turned the laptop slightly so Ryan could see the final composite frame of video evidence. The moment of the traffic stop, the positioning, the alignment of events that no longer supported the original report narrative. It means, the investigator said carefully, that intent and procedure are no longer aligned in your documentation. Ryan stared at the screen without blinking. Somewhere inside him, something had stopped resisting. Not fully surrendered, just paused, like a structure that had finally realized it could no longer hold its original shape. In another part of the courthouse, Naomi was standing with federal counsel near the main glass overlook. From here, the city of Richmond stretched outward in quiet morning light. The storm had fully passed now, leaving only reflective surfaces and softened sound. The counselor beside her spoke carefully. The formal review panel will conclude preliminary findings within the next hour. Naomi nodded slightly. And Officer Keller, she asked. He will be subject to federal disciplinary proceedings pending final review, the counselor replied. Naomi remained silent for a moment, not because she lacked response, but because she was measuring something larger than the question itself. Systems did not resolve around individuals. They resolved around exposure. Inside that exposure, truth was not dramatic. It was structural. Downstairs, the courthouse lobby began to fill with early press presence, though access remained restricted. Cameras were positioned outside, not inside. Reporters spoke in controlled speculation, trying to piece together a narrative that was still being finalized in rooms they could not enter. Naomi did not move toward them. She remained where she was, above the noise, observing without engagement. Ryan Keller was brought into the final hearing chamber shortly after. The room was no longer cold or warm. It was neutral, designed to remove emotional distortion from procedural evaluation. He sat across from a long table where multiple federal officials reviewed final documentation. One of them spoke first. Officer Keller, this hearing is not about assumption. It is about verified sequence. Ryan nodded once. Understood. The official continued. Do you confirm that all actions taken during the traffic stop were conducted in accordance with departmental procedure? A long silence followed. Not defiance. Not strategy. Processing. Ryan looked at the table in front of him, then briefly at the closed folder containing his case file. For the first time since the night began, he did not reach for certainty. He simply answered. No, the word did not echo. It settled. Back in the upper corridor, Naomi Whitaker received final confirmation from federal counsel. Case review complete. Administrative suspension of Officer Keller pending formal federal adjudication. She closed the message and placed her phone back into her pocket. There was no expression of victory on her face. No visible satisfaction. Only completion. Outside the courthouse, sunlight fully replaced the remnants of storm clouds. The city moved forward as it always did, unaware of the exact moment when something inside its structure had corrected itself. Naomi finally turned away from the glass and began walking down the corridor toward the exit. Each step was steady, not urgent, not hesitant. Behind her, inside the system she had just moved through, multiple processes continued adjusting themselves to the truth that had already been established. And in a separate chamber, Officer Ryan Keller remained seated under observation, no longer positioned as authority, no longer positioned as certainty, but as part of a record that had already begun to redefine itself without